Well, welcome. We are in Ezekiel chapters 23 through 25 today. It's Wednesday, so we are making progress through the book. Let me point out a couple things. One is I have turned on comments. So down below this video, you'll see an area where you can make comments, and love for you to do that. I'd ask you to share some insights with us as you go through your reading. Maybe some prayer requests, plans for the weekend. It's Wednesday, so maybe you're looking forward to catching up on your reading or doing something fun. Love to hear that. So make some comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Also, in the last 20 seconds or so of the video, you'll see a couple of things pop up. On one side, you'll see the, I think on this side actually, you'll see a link to the video that's the overview of Ezekiel. If you haven't looked at that yet, I'd encourage you to take 30 minutes, perhaps this weekend. Watch that. It'll give you a great overview of Ezekiel, help you understand the book and where it fits and how it works. The other is a kind of a circle with a T in it that would allow you to subscribe to the channel. The advantage of subscribing is that whenever I post a new video, you'll get a notification in your inbox, so you'll know right away when the videos are coming up. I'll be adding videos as we go along, as I get into kind of a rhythm, not only in the Word, but I'll be doing more in-depth studies on the weekends and maybe some special studies from time to time as well. Again, love to hear from you, what you'd love to see and what you'd love to hear, and how I can help you in your progress in growing in grace and godliness. So today we're looking at the last part of the section that's explaining the righteousness of God's judgment. So this section ends in chapter 24. Today we're going to see in chapter 23 some parables, parable of two sisters, chapter 24, the parable of the boiling pot, and then chapter 25 is where we begin this new section where God is now talking about the judgment he is going to bring on the nations around Israel. I think this is an important section. It goes from chapters 25 through 32. And it might seem out of place when you first see it because he's talking about the judgment on Jerusalem, then judgment on the nations, then restoration of Jerusalem. Well, what's that all about? Why do you put that in there? I think what's happening here is twofold. One is, as we'll see, God is faithful to his covenant. He's going to be faithful to his covenant with Jerusalem and Judah, and he's going to be faithful to his covenant with regard to the nations outside Israel. So number one, we see God's faithfulness in these chapters. Number two, we see God's universal power, that he is not some local deity, but he is the God of the universe. He's God of the whole earth. In fact, he created it. He owns all the land. He allocates the nations and where they go and how long they stand. And by showing the judgment he brings on the nations, he is demonstrating his sovereignty. So I think that's how it fits in, and we'll be transitioning into that section at the close of today's video. Chapter 23, then, we have this parable of two sisters, and it's uses very graphic language. I'll warn you before you get into that. He likens them to whores. Later in the chapter, he talks about them being adulteresses. If you go back to Leviticus 20, verse 10, you'll find that the sentence for adultery was death. So they deserve the punishment. That's the section we're in. Adultery, whether it was physical adultery or in this case spiritual adultery, results in death. Basically no going back. You've broken the covenant of your marriage. You've broken your covenant with God. Judgment's going to fall on you. As I've mentioned before as well, I think that sexual sin falls into a different category, and it seems to be the consistently portrayed in the Bible as kind of the culmination of all these sins, that as sins grow and build on one another, and you wander from the Lord a little bit and it gets further and further away, the culmination of that is sexual sin, and it results ultimately in the judgment of God. We see this in, again, Romans 1, where we see a progression of sin from not recognizing God becomes into homosexuality and lesbianism, and then judgment. And it's the pattern that we see in the Bible. So let's jump into chapter 23 here. Got it here in front of me. First 5 verses introduces the first sister, which is Samaria. And again, verse 3, she played the whore in Egypt. Go all the way back, over 1,000 years, God has been patient. And you recall the incident where Moses went up on Mount Sinai. They collected the jewelry, the earrings from the Israelites. And as Aaron put it, he threw that into the fire. Poof, out popped a cow, some kind of idol that they worshipped and partied with. So from Egypt, verses 5 through 10 introduce the other sister. Again, this is Jerusalem, Judah. And in verse 11, we see this indictment against Judah, that she did not learn the lesson from Samaria. I mean, Samaria was taken into captivity by the Assyrians for their departure from the word of the Lord. Jerusalem did not learn that lesson. In fact, they compounded their sin. In light of what they saw of Samaria, they just disregarded what had happened and went on sinning. So they didn't learn, but acted even worse. So they're going to be held accountable. Verse 22 down to about verse 35 then, we see what we've seen before in the Bible, this talionic judgment, that the judgment of God is somehow appropriate or commensurate with the offense. So the offense of Jerusalem is that they went after lovers. They enticed them. They drew them in. They embraced their lovers. And of course, what he's talking about here is spiritual idolatry. Some of that spiritual idolatry included adultery, included lewd sexual practices. But the idea here is that this spiritual idolatry is likened to spiritual adultery. So they are turned over to their lovers, to these people that entice them. God is saying, essentially, if you want to worship other gods, go worship them and see how that works out for you. Why does God do this? Why is he so severe? Verse 27 answers that question in chapter 23. God says, "Thus I will put an end to your lewdness and to your whoring begun in the land of Egypt, so that you shall not lift up your eyes to them or remember Egypt anymore." This destruction of Jerusalem and the 70 years of exile cured Egypt, or cured Israel of their idolatry. And that's what God is doing here. He is a loving Father. He is kind. Again, Hebrews 12, 5 and 6, 5 and following, really, down to verse 10, I guess, says that the proof that God loves us is he chastises us. So just as we won't let our children do things that are ultimately self-destructive, but we'll correct them, so God corrects the people he loves. And his range of correction goes from scourging to mild reproof. My prayer for myself as I read through the prophets especially, or Ezekiel in this section, is that God would illuminate my mind to not only understand his word, but that I would be sensitive to its application, so that I might sense God's reproof of me before he has to escalate it to scourging, as we see here. And that's really my prayer for you as well. I pray for all of those who look at these videos essentially every day, and pray that God would illuminate your mind, not just to understand his word, but to apply his word, and that you would grow in grace and godliness. And that's what we see here. Continuing then, starting in verse 36 of chapter 23, we see this section on the indictment and the sentence passed against Jerusalem and Samaria. Notice in verse 45 it says, righteous men shall pass judgment on them with the sentence of adulteresses and with the sentence of women who shed blood, because they are adulteresses and blood is on their hands. Who are these righteous men? I think they're the prophets, the true prophets, like Isaiah, like Jeremiah, like Daniel, like Ezekiel, who confronted Israel on their sin, even though it was unheeded. These are the righteous men. And as I said, Leviticus 20 verse 10 talks about the sentence for adultery is death. Therefore, the sentence for spiritual adultery is also death, and that's what they're going to experience. Chapter 24 then talks about a parable of a boiling pot, and this boiling pot is parable prophecy is coming in about 588, in January 588, so it's about 18 months before the destruction of Jerusalem. And the first 5 verses is this preparation of the boiling pot. So in the parable, Jerusalem is the pot, and the people of Israel are the choice meats that are put into it in the first 5 verses. And then verses 6 through 11 are talking about how the pot itself is defiled. It's got rust, it's filthy. Therefore, everything that is put into it is also defiled, also becomes filthy. And that's what's happened to the people of Jerusalem. The city itself has become a hub of idolatry, and people who come into the city are affected by it. Again, you know, I consider myself in this, that I live in a world that's trying to live separately from God. It's what the Apostle John called a ungodly cosmos. I'm living in an ungodly age. We see that around us all the time. And I fear as to how that is rubbed off on me, like the Israelites in Jerusalem, the idolatry of the city has rubbed off on them. Finally, in verse 13 through 14, it says that essentially the time has run out. God's patience is over. See, a tragic event in verses 15 through 24 is the death of Ezekiel's wife. She becomes a sign of the death that's coming. And Ezekiel is prevented from mourning. Significant change is happening here. And Ezekiel is demonstrating that. And then the chapter ends, verses 25 through 27, with this end of muteness. Remember in chapter 3, verse 26, Ezekiel was given this selective muteness. He can only speak when God tells him to speak. Otherwise, he's mute. And that is ended here with the fall of Jerusalem. Chapter 25 moves into this new section then about the judgment of the nations. And this first judgment is the nations that are east and then around west. So it really goes, if you have a map, it goes clockwise. And I want to point out that the original Abrahamic covenant, which is the root of the land covenant and the Davidic covenant and the new covenant, the root is the Abrahamic covenant. The end of the Abrahamic covenant says that the nations will be judged by how they treat Israel. Those who bless you, I will bless, and those who curse you, I will curse. In the latter part of the lat phrase there, those who curse you, that word for curse is a mild word, just treat you with derision, reject you, treat you with mild rejection. And God says, I will curse them. That word is different for curse, much stronger. We see that happening here. I want to point that out. I'm going to go maybe a minute over today. But look how he judges the Ammonites first in verses 5 through 7. We remember from chapter 21, verse 28, that after Jerusalem's destruction, the Ammonites are destroyed as well, and that comes first in this list. He said, because you said, "Ha-ha," over my sanctuary when it was profaned, and over the land of Israel when it was made desolate, and over the house of Judah when they went into exile. That's in verse 3. God's judging them for their attitude toward his sanctuary, his city, and his nation when they were conquered. Verse 6, he says, you rejoiced with all the malice within your soul against the land of Israel. So they were partying while God's people were being judged, and they're being judged for that in accordance with the Abrahamic covenant. Verse 8 down to 11 is about Moab. And again, Moab is just south of Ammon. And look what he says to that he's going to judge them, and they will know that he is the Lord. Behold, the house of, because they said that, behold, the house of Judah is like all the other nations. So they discounted the fact that they were God's chosen people, just acted like they were anybody, any other nation in the earth, not God's chosen people. And judgment even today comes on those nations and those churches who reject God's people and don't treat them with the respect that they deserve. Edom, again, Edom acted revengefully against the house of Judah. Again, they're being judged for how they handled or they reacted to God's people. Verse 15 is Philistia, this area that's west along the Mediterranean. Because the Philistines acted revengefully and took vengeance with malice of soul to destroy in never-ending enmity. So because they were vented this enmity against Israel, they're being judged. So as we go into this section, we see again God's faithfulness. He's faithful to judge his people because he loves them. And he's faithful to judge the nations around Israel because he loves Israel. And he's made this pledge that he'll defend them. Isn't it great to know that God defends us and that he will chastise us, sometimes severely, because he loves us, and then ultimately he will defend us. So God bless you, brothers and sisters. Sorry I went over a little bit, but I hope it was worth it. God bless you.